She was probably the greatest wife anyone could ask for. She was incredibly affirming. We spent every night together for hours just talking and talking and talking.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello and a warm welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic community in true crime. A beach memorial will be held Sunday, that's today, at 3 p.m. at the beach access near 91 South Ocean Boulevard, North Myrtle Beach. That's right very close to where I am right now. But in the meantime, let's talk a little bit more about Pastor John Paul Miller. He owns and runs the whole show at Solid Rock Church in Myrtle Beach. But is the show and is the man behind it rock solid? Now, in his interview with ABC 15, does his grief come across as genuine? I will put a link to the whole thing so you can watch it, but you certainly caught a glimpse of that at the beginning. He says, "We spent every night together for hours just talking and talking and talking." But strictly speaking, that's not entirely accurate. More recently, the talking and talking and talking had become litigious. And MICA had also gone online recently accusing her ex-husband, or certainly implying that terrible, terrible things had happened. Let's put it this way. If he describes her as probably the greatest wife anyone would ask for, would she describe him in the same terms? I'm not talking about him appropriating her voice, but if she's granted the opportunity to speak of her own accord, would she call him the greatest husband anyone could ask for? Because from her own social media, it doesn't appear as if she would say the same thing. Let's also not forget she was filing for divorce, something Pastor John Paul cagely avoids acknowledging to the media, to his congregation, and in the obituary he wrote for her. She was filing for divorce at the time that this was all taking place. How relevant is that in this situation? How relevant do you think it is? Before we get to the rest of this analysis, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're enjoying this analysis, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So there is also a mismatch between the sniffy faux grief in his media interview. It certainly seems a little put on, if you ask me. And then the not particularly grief-stricken Solid Rock pastor telling his congregation to stand and not talk about what he's about to tell them. When he's addressing his church and telling his congregation at the end of the sermon that his wife has just died, I mean, it was literally the next morning, one might say that because they were divorcing, that he might not feel much grief, that he might have mixed feelings. But then why is he showing it to the media? Why is it so blatant to the media? And now a certain amount of time has gone by. One would imagine the right way to prioritize such an important event, the death of someone once very closely associated with their church, is that should have been done right at the beginning, rather than dealt with as a casual postscript at the end. Now, just because the pastor seems a little dodgy in his dealings with his ex-wife's death and his affect is somewhat off, these are hardly grounds to elevate him to a murder suspect, except for the broader circumstances, the context and the timing of the incident. Did you know that John Paul was served with divorce papers just 48 hours before MICA died? Also worth noting is the pastor's own autobiography. It's obviously what he wrote, describing himself on the church's website. He writes the following. Pastor John Paul Miller spent his teenage years playing the piano in churches as well as nightclubs. He thought church was for fake people who were one way in public and another way behind closed doors. One day in his mid-20s, he gave his life to Jesus Christ. In 2006, John Paul stepped out in faith and started his first church, Solid Rock Ministries, in the Socasti Library. His first sermon was 6 minutes long because he only knew one scripture. His first congregation was his family, a few friends, and several former drug-related acquaintances. Pastor John Paul has been involved in the music department of churches all across the Grand Strand area before starting his new church, Solid Rock, at Market Common, where he has pastored since 2016. So this has kind of been going on for about 8 years. PJP has 5 children. Logan, who is married to his wife Madison, Zachary, I'm not going to go through all of those. PJP and his wife MICA have a heart to love God and love people. So MICA is also acknowledged in this, obviously now somewhat dated autobiography. It's obviously going to need to be updated now. The welcoming, real, and approachable attitude is what has won the hearts of everyone who attends Solid Rock at Market Common. It's interesting that he mentions his 5 children first, and then Micah also last in this whole thing. It's also interesting that how in his own words he admits thinking church was for fake people and that there might be another way behind closed doors. Because that is the overarching question in this case. Is the pastor a wolf in sheep's clothing? Is he the perpetrator in something more sinister, something criminal? Or is he just somewhat odd? My own impression, driving to the church, researching some of the comments made, looking at the way that he dresses, the way that he carries himself, the flowery shirt that he's wearing in this interview with ABC 15. Also looking at the social media, is that the church is quite an operation with a lot of social media going on. There's a YouTube channel, there's a podcast, there's even merch. And so, one can imagine getting divorced in the middle of this. And it appears Micah wasn't going to divorce him quietly, would involve a lot of dirty laundry. I mean, when does a divorce not involve that? But you can imagine when it's to do with a pastor, and it's a one-man show. It's not that he's got other guys that he can really rely on. It's really his baby. You can imagine that he probably thought and thinks that this is going to be very expensive in some shape or form, for sure. Financially expensive, but it could also be reputationally expensive. And so the question is, how does that factor into the events as they unfolded on the night Micah died? Again, I think we have to ask the simple question, does John Paul have an alibi? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.